In 1845, a mysterious blight swept across the fields of Ireland. Within weeks, the potato plants that millions depended on for survival turned black and rotted in the ground. The smell of decay hung over entire counties. Families that had lived on potatoes for generations suddenly had nothing left to eat. Over the next 7 years, roughly 1 million people starved to death. Another million fled the country on overcrowded ships, and many died at sea before ever reaching land. It became one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. And at the center of it all was a single crop, a lumpy, dirt-covered root vegetable that most of Europe had refused to eat only a century earlier. That was 1845. But the story of the potato begins thousands of years earlier, long before any European had ever seen one. Before Europe ever saw a potato, travel back roughly 8,000 years, high into the Andes mountains of what is now southern Peru and Bolivia. Above the cloud line at more than 12,000 feet, wild potato plants clung to rocky, windswept soil. These were not the golden, starchy potatoes we recognize today. They were small, some no bigger than a walnut. They were bitter, and they were genuinely toxic. Wild potatoes produced solanine and tomatine, glycoalkaloid compounds that could cause nausea, vomiting, cramps, and in severe cases, death. Eating them raw was not merely unpleasant. It was dangerous. The indigenous peoples living in these mountains had learned that lesson the hard way over many generations. But they also discovered something else. Something that would shape the next 8,000 years of human agriculture. They learned that soaking wild tubers in cold mountain streams for several days allowed the running water to draw out some of the toxins. Then, by exposing the soaked potatoes to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing at high altitude, where nighttime temperatures regularly dropped below zero, they could break down more of the harmful compounds and make the tubers safe to eat. It was a painstaking multi-day process. It required patience, experimentation, and an intimate understanding of chemistry. Although these ancient farmers would never have described it in those terms. But it worked. Over thousands of years, Andean farmers selected the least bitter tubers and replanted the mildest specimens generation after generation. Slowly, they bred the poison out and the starch in. They did not know the word genetics. They were practicing it anyway. The Inca Empire built on a root. By the time the Inca Empire rose to power across western South America in the 1400s, the potato had become something extraordinary. Inca farmers worked terraced fields carved into steep mountain slopes around Cusco and throughout the highlands. Together, they cultivated more than 3,000 distinct varieties. Some were bright yellow. Some were deep purple. Some were red, white, or blue. Others were so dark they appeared almost black. Their shapes ranged from smooth and perfectly round to twisted, gnarled, and lumpy enough to terrify a modern grocery shopper. Each variety was adapted to a particular altitude, soil type, and microclimate. The Inca did not simply grow potatoes. They built an entire agricultural science around them. And through that science, they built a civilization. They also solved a problem that would frustrate European farmers for centuries. Storage. Fresh potatoes rot. In a world without refrigeration, that is a serious problem. The Inca solution, known as chuño, was brilliant in its simplicity. Farmers spread freshly harvested potatoes across flat ground at high altitude and allowed them to freeze solid overnight in the bitter Andean cold. The following morning, as the intense equatorial sun warmed the mountainside, families walked barefoot over the frozen tubers, pressing out the moisture with their feet. They repeated the freezing and stomping for several days. What remained was light, chalky, bone-dry, and weighed almost nothing. Chuño could be stored for 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, or even longer without spoiling. It was arguably one of the earliest processed foods in human history. More importantly, it was a logistical miracle. It fed Inca armies during long military campaigns across the Andes. It sustained entire cities through years of poor harvests. Chuño became so central to Inca life that time was sometimes measured by how long it took to cook a pot of potatoes. Distance could be measured by how much chuño a traveler needed to carry between two places. This was not merely a crop. It was the foundation of one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Spanish took the gold and missed the real treasure. Yet the people who would carry the potato to the rest of the world understood almost none of this. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, they were searching for gold and silver. They found both in staggering quantities. What they barely noticed, and certainly did not value, was the ugly little tuber eaten by the people they were conquering at nearly every meal. Spanish soldiers and administrators carried a few potatoes back to the Iberian Peninsula sometime around 1570, but no one was especially excited. There were no celebrations, no royal proclamations. Potatoes were handed to sailors as cheap provisions on long voyages, partly to protect them from scurvy. They were also donated to hospitals and monasteries as food for the sick and the poor. The Spanish crown was too busy counting Inca gold to promote a food associated with people it considered inferior. That decision appeared small at the time. It was not. Why Europe feared the potato? When the potato spread through Europe in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the reaction ranged from suspicion to outright horror. To understand why, you have to understand the world Europeans lived in. They grew wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These were grains, noble crops. They grew above the ground, in sunlight, reaching toward the heavens. Bread made from grain was considered a gift from God. Entire economies, feudal systems, and civilizations were organized around grain. The potato was different. It grew underground, in dirt, in darkness. It was lumpy, misshapen, and covered in strange little growths people called eyes. Worse, it belonged to the same botanical family as deadly nightshade, one of Europe's most poisonous plants. To deeply religious and superstitious Europeans, that did not look like a botanical coincidence. It looked like a warning from God. Rumors about the potato spread faster than the crop itself. In parts of France, potatoes were formally blamed for causing leprosy. In 1596, the Parliament of Besançon banned potato cultivation, claiming the crop spread the disease. In Russia, the Orthodox Church called the potato the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin against God. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people blamed potatoes for flatulence, uncontrollable desire, scrofula, and even moral corruption. Scrofula was a form of tuberculosis that caused severe swelling in the neck. Scottish Presbyterians refused to eat potatoes because the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible. Therefore, they argued, God could not have intended the crop for human consumption. And no, that was not invented for this story. It was a real theological argument made by real clergymen in real churches. For nearly 200 years after reaching Europe, the potato survived mostly as a botanical curiosity. Wealthy people grew it as an ornamental plant. Its delicate purple and white flowers were considered beautiful. Marie Antoinette reportedly wore potato blossoms in her hair at court. Botanical gardens in London, Seville, Vienna, and other European cities displayed potato plants beside exotic specimens from the New World. Scholars debated whether the tuber was edible, medicinal, or dangerous. But eating potatoes regularly, that was considered beneath the dignity of any respectable European. Potatoes were animal feed at best, and a symbol of desperate poverty at worst. In England, even the poorest labourers could consider it an insult to be offered potatoes instead of bread. The class divide could not have been clearer. Bread was civilized. Potatoes were not. For a time, the potato seemed trapped in that humiliating position. A rejected, misunderstood crop growing at the edges of European agriculture, while millions went hungry around it. But that would not last. War changed it. Famine changed it. and a handful of stubborn, slightly eccentric people changed it. The king turned potatoes into a weapon. The first major turning point came in the Kingdom of Prussia. Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great, ruled Prussia from 1740 to 1786. And he had a very specific problem. Prussia was repeatedly dragged into devastating wars. During those wars, enemy armies burned wheat fields to starve the population into submission. Grain was easy to destroy. Set it on fire and watch it burn. But potatoes were hidden underground. An invading army could march directly across a potato field without realizing that dinner was buried 6 inches beneath its boots. Frederick saw the military potential immediately. In 1756, he issued the Kartoffelbefehl, roughly translated as the Potato Order. He commanded Prussian peasants to plant potatoes, or risk having their ears and noses cut off. Predictably, the peasants were not enthusiastic. They considered potatoes disgusting and fit only for livestock. According to one widely repeated account, villagers in Kolberg told the king that potatoes had neither smell nor taste, and that not even dogs would eat them. Frederick was not amused. But he was clever. According to legend, he tried an entirely different approach. He planted a royal potato garden outside Berlin and stationed uniformed soldiers around it. The message required no explanation. If the king needed armed guards to protect these plants, they must be extremely valuable. At night, Prussian peasants began sneaking into the garden to steal seed potatoes. According to the legend, that was exactly what Frederick intended. Scholars still debate whether every detail of this story is historically accurate. The result, however, is beyond dispute. Within a single generation, the potato had become a major staple across Prussia and much of northern Germany. The pharmacist taught France to eat. Across the border in France, Antoine-Augustin Parmentier was fighting the same battle with even more flair. Parmentier served as a pharmacist in the French army during the 7 Years' War. Captured by Prussian forces, he spent 3 years as a prisoner. During his captivity, the Prussians fed him potatoes as his primary food. Day after day, meal after meal, Parmentier ate potatoes. He did not die. He did not develop leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. In fact, he left captivity in surprisingly good health. He was healthier than many soldiers living on the standard French military diet. That experience forced Parmentier to question everything France believed about the potato. After returning home, he devoted the next several decades to one mission. He would convince the French to eat potatoes, if it was the last thing he ever did. He hosted elaborate dinners for Parisian high society, serving potatoes in every course, from the appetizer to the dessert. He presented potato blossoms to King Louis XVI, who reportedly placed one in his buttonhole and wore it around the palace. He persuaded Queen Marie Antoinette to wear the blossoms in her hair, turning the potato flower into a fashion accessory. Then Parmentier borrowed a version of Frederick's trick. He planted a large potato field in the sandy, infertile soil of the Sablons Plain outside Paris. He posted armed guards during the day to make the field look important, and conveniently removed them every night, allowing curious Parisians to steal the plants. Decades before public relations had a name, Parmentier was running a one-man publicity campaign for the potato. And it worked. By the late 1700s, France had finally begun accepting the potato as human food. The French still honor Parmentier today. Hacquis Parmentier, a dish similar to shepherd's pie, bears his name. Paris also has a metro station, a boulevard, and a hospital named after him. The man gave his life to a root vegetable, and France gave his name back to history. Ireland, the potato's darkest chapter. While France and Prussia slowly embraced the potato through royal orders and clever persuasion, something far more dangerous was unfolding across the English Channel. In Ireland. This is where the potato's story takes its darkest turn. In the 1700s, Ireland was under British rule. Most Irish land belonged to English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords. Many of those landlords lived in England and never visited the estates they controlled. Irish Catholic peasants, who made up most of the population, worked tiny rented plots they did not own. They could be evicted at any moment. British laws systematically restricted what Irish Catholics could inherit or buy, which professions they could enter, and how much land they could rent. Families were forced onto smaller and smaller plots of rocky, boggy, marginal soil. Many survived on only 1 or 2 acres. For this brutal system, the potato was almost perfectly designed. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for an entire year. No other crop came close. Potatoes grew in poor soil where grain failed. They thrived in Ireland's cool, wet climate, where wheat and barley were unreliable. They required almost no equipment or investment. No plow, no horse, no mill, only a spade, seed potatoes, and enough rain, something Ireland never lacked. A family could survive almost entirely on potatoes and buttermilk, and nutritionally, that diet was more complete than it sounds. Potatoes supplied carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, potassium, and even some protein. Buttermilk added calcium and fat. Together, they could sustain life for years. And sustain it they did. Ireland's population rose from roughly 3 million in 1700 to more than 8 million by 1840. The potato made that astonishing growth possible. But hidden inside this dependence was a catastrophic flaw. One that anyone who understood agriculture should have feared. Nearly all Irish potatoes came from a single variety. The Irish lumper. Farmers did not grow several types. They grew one. That meant potato fields across the entire country were genetically almost identical. A disease capable of killing one plant could kill them all. There was no genetic diversity, no resistant variety in reserve, no plan B. The food supply of an entire nation rested on one genetic line, of one crop, planted in one way, and harvested at one time. The clock was already ticking. Ireland simply could not hear it. When the fields turned black. In the late summer of 1845, a cargo ship carrying potatoes from the Americas reached a European port. Hidden within that cargo were microscopic spores of an organism called Phytophthora infestans. It was a water mold that thrived in the cool, wet conditions of Ireland. The blight moved first through Belgium and the Netherlands, destroying crops as it spread. Then it crossed into England. And then it reached Ireland. Plants that looked healthy in the morning were black, wilted, and rotting by evening. Farmers entered green, thriving fields and found entire acres collapsed overnight into stinking blackened mush. When they dug into the soil, desperate to save something, the tubers had already turned into foul-smelling pulp. In western counties such as Mayo, Galway, and Clare, the stench became so overpowering that people covered their noses and mouths with rags simply to breathe. The first year was devastating. But what transformed a failed harvest into an apocalypse was one terrible fact. The blight came back. It returned in 1846, worse than before. Then again in 1847. And again in 1848. Year after year, the potatoes rotted in the ground. Families with no other food began dying in their homes, beside the roads, and in ditches near the fields that had failed them. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through a population weakened by hunger. Entire villages in Western Ireland emptied. Workhouses designed for a few hundred people were packed with thousands. Mass graves filled behind them. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died from starvation and the diseases that followed. Another million emigrated. Many boarded ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that they became known as coffin ships. Passengers died by the dozens during Atlantic crossings. Their bodies were thrown overboard. Ireland lost roughly 1/4 of its population in less than a decade. The country never fully recovered that number. Even today, Nearly 180 years later, the population of Ireland remains lower than it was before the famine. When policy deepened the disaster, the British government's response made the catastrophe even worse. While Irish families starved, grain, butter, livestock, and other food continued to leave Ireland for England, sometimes under armed escort. Relief programs were slow, underfunded, and tied to humiliating conditions. Starving men were forced into hard labor, building roads that led nowhere. In return, they received wages too small to buy food whose price was rising beyond reach. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official overseeing famine relief, described the catastrophe as God's judgment on a morally inferior people. He argued that too much aid would make the Irish dependent on charity. Those words appeared in official government correspondence, not in a private diary. The famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster made catastrophically worse by political indifference and deliberate policy choices. The potato had helped lift Ireland up. The blight brought it crashing down. The famine that reshaped the world. The consequences traveled far beyond the island. The million Irish people who escaped the famine did not simply disappear into the world. They reshaped it. Massive waves of Irish immigrants entered Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. There they faced poverty, discrimination, and fierce anti-Catholic hostility. But they also built communities, labor movements, and political organizations that would influence American politics for generations. Others settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Toronto. They carried a deep inherited anger toward British rule. That anger fueled Irish nationalist movements for decades and eventually contributed to Irish independence in 1922. The Great Famine did more than empty Ireland. It planted Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish grievances across the English-speaking world. The echoes of that scattering are still visible today. The lesson Ireland left behind. But here is the strange, unexpected part. The famine did not destroy the potato's reputation. If anything, it proved how indispensable the crop had become. The lesson was not that potatoes were too dangerous to grow. The lesson was that no nation should stake everything on a single genetic variety. Grow more types. Breed for resistance. Diversify. Plant breeders across Europe and the Americas began developing varieties resistant to Phytophthora infestans. Agricultural scientists established seed programs designed to preserve genetic diversity. The disaster that nearly destroyed Ireland became the catalyst for a new era of scientific potato farming. The potato conquers the world. Russia had been fighting its own potato battles long before the Irish famine. Catherine the Great promoted potato cultivation in the 1760s, ordering seed potatoes to be distributed to provincial governors. But Russian peasants resisted, sometimes violently. During the 1840s, forced planting campaigns triggered what historians call the potato riots. Entire villages rose against government officials. Peasants burned potato fields and attacked bureaucrats trying to impose the crop. Eventually, the government prevailed. By the 1850s and 60s, government pressure, agricultural reform, and simple hunger had broken through the resistance. Within decades, Russian peasants were growing potatoes as a staple beside bread. By the early 1900s, Russia had become one of the world's largest potato producers. Rural communities gave the crop a revealing new name: the second bread. In China, European traders and Christian missionaries introduced the potato during the 17th century. For a long time, it remained a minor curiosity. That changed when farmers in the mountainous provinces of Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou discovered that potatoes thrived at altitudes and in soils where rice and wheat could not. The potato filled a gap no other crop could fill. By the middle of the 20th century, China had become the world's largest potato producer. By the 21st century, it was growing more than 90 million metric tons per year. More than any other nation, India followed a similar path. British colonial officials introduced potatoes to the Indian subcontinent in the late 1700s, but adoption took decades. Once Indian farmers embraced the crop, production rose rapidly. Today, India is the world's second-largest potato producer, and the crop helps feed hundreds of millions of people. The potato is now so deeply embedded in Indian cuisine that many people forget it is not native to the region. Across Africa, the potato arrived later, but spread with remarkable speed. Farmers in the East African highlands, in countries such as Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda, discovered that potatoes performed exceptionally well in their cool mountain climates. The United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization have described the potato as an important tool against hunger and malnutrition. Several African nations have launched national programs to increase production and strengthen food security. From staple crop to global industry, globally, the potato is now the fourth most important food crop behind wheat, rice, and corn. More than 300 million metric tons are produced every year across more than 150 countries. The scale of the modern potato industry would astonish an Inca farmer. French fries, probably developed in Belgium or France in the late 1700s, have become a multi-billion-dollar global industry. They may be the most popular cooked food on Earth. Americans alone consume roughly 50 pounds of frozen potato products per person each year. Most of it comes in the form of fries. The potato chip, according to legend, was invented in 1853 by a frustrated chef in Saratoga Springs, New York. The chef sliced potatoes paper-thin and fried them crisp, supposedly to spite a difficult customer. That simple act created another enormous industry. The average American consumes about 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 17 pounds of potato chips every year. McDonald's alone uses more than 3 billion pounds of potatoes annually for its fries. Those potatoes come from farms across Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. More than food. But potatoes are far more than food. And this next part often surprises people. Potato starch is used to manufacture paper, textiles, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics. Vodka, one of the world's most widely consumed spirits, has traditionally been produced from potatoes in Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists learned to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber for military tires after natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia were cut off. Potato derivatives appear in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, animal feed, and even the adhesive on postage stamps. The potato is not only feeding the world, it is helping hold parts of the industrial world together. The first vegetable in space. Then, in 1995, the potato became the first vegetable ever grown in outer space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin cultivated potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia while researching long-duration space missions. If humanity establishes permanent settlements on the Moon or Mars, many agricultural scientists believe potatoes will be among the first crops planted. They grow in poor mineral-heavy soil. They produce more calories per acre than grain crops. They require far less water than rice. They store well in harsh conditions. And they provide a broad range of essential nutrients. The same qualities that made potatoes indispensable in the Andes 8,000 years ago may one day help feed human beings on another planet. From poisonous weed to food for Mars. Think about that for a moment. A crop the Spanish barely noticed, that France once blamed for leprosy, that Russians called the devil's fruit, and that Scottish clergyman rejected because it was not mentioned in the Bible, may become one of the first foods humans grow on Mars. The potato began as a small, poisonous plant clinging to rocky slopes above the clouds in South America. Indigenous farmers spent thousands of years transforming it into something extraordinary. The Inca built an empire upon it. The Spanish ignored it. Europe feared it. A Prussian king and a French pharmacist dragged it into acceptance against enormous resistance. It fueled Ireland's astonishing population growth. And when it failed, it killed or displaced millions, reshaping the demographic map of the Atlantic world. Yet the potato survived its greatest catastrophe. It became one of the most important crops in human history, grown on every inhabited continent, and perhaps soon beyond this planet. Not bad for a lumpy root vegetable that nobody wanted. Call to action. If this story changed the way you see the potato, subscribe to the channel. Then tell us in the comments, which part of its history surprised you most? And if you want more hidden stories behind the foods that shaped civilization, like this video so more people can discover them.